Today we celebrate the feast of actually Pope John Paul II. October 22nd is his feast day, but he actually gets trumped because it's Sunday. So we celebrate the resurrection. But I still want to speak a little bit about Pope John Paul II. Just an incredible bishop, an incredible priest, an incredible pope for the Catholic Church for many, many years. And many of you, I'm sure, have a deep love for him, some of his writings, or even to remember the time under his pontificate when he was the Pope. They say that he just had an incredible love, a passion, and a zeal. And the people who met him recounted that it could be a crowd of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, but when he saw you, you just felt like you were fully known. You were just fully known by him. That he just had this way of looking at people and communicating God's love, the goodness of God to them. And if you know anything about Pope John Paul II, he wrote a lot in his papacy, as his time as Pope, and he wrote on a lot of themes. But one theme that ties into today, World Mission Sunday, is how John Paul II speaks about mission. How do we as Christians actually proclaim unceasingly the good news? How do we actually go out on mission? How do we spread the gospel of Jesus Christ? Let other people encounter that goodness, that depth, that intimacy that we ourselves have encountered in Christ, in the goodness of God. So from one of his letters, he says, "Since they are members of the church by virtue of their baptism, all Christians share responsibility for missionary activity." So he says, all Christians share the responsibility for missionary activity. So you and I, none of us can get out of it. So it's by virtue of our baptism that we actually are called to share, to be missionaries, to proclaim the good news to others. He goes on saying that missionary cooperation is rooted and lived, above all, in personal union with Christ. That missionary activity, cooperation is rooted and above all in personal union with Christ. So for me, I think that it can help us when we think about, how are we supposed to be missionaries? How do we actually bring the good news to other people? Well, it's all this. It's all rooted in our own personal communion with Jesus Christ. So it's through our own holiness of life that we actually are credible witnesses of the power of the gospel to the world. If you've had the chance to join for some of our series on faith that we've been doing, that Father Peter's been speaking on, the gift of faith and how do we live our faith attractively and how do we actually share our faith with other people? How do we share the good stuff that the Lord has done in our life in an attractive way that just invites other people to be able to come into that, to come into contact with God, with the mystery of the person of Jesus. And what's been really beautiful, we've been talking about how it's not so much apologetics, like having the right answers, knowing our faith up in our head, but it's actually just about sharing how faith has changed the way we live our life. And this is what John Paul is speaking about, that above all, missionary activity bears fruit because of our own personal union and contact with the person of Jesus Christ. That it's our holiness of life that actually bears credible witness. So we've been speaking not about these apologetics, not about having all the right answers, but just about sharing, well, this is what the faith has done for me and for my life. So a few things that has come up this last couple of weeks for me has just been beautiful of how we can actually, we need to be stretched to share our faith in an attractive way with our family, with our friends, with those we work with, to allow people to come into contact with Christ. But it's actually easier than we think. It's just sharing from the abundant goodness that we've already received. So it's as simple as saying, well, here's how faith has made an impact in my life. You know, that me and my family, we experienced a suffering, a tragedy, and if we didn't have our faith, I don't know how we would have made it through that. just having that little witness of sharing what faith has made for our life, or even just encouraging one another, all of us here, in the battle for prayer. I was speaking with a young lady a couple weeks ago, and she was just saying how prayer is a battle. It's a struggle. But she says, you know what saves me? My weekly holy hour in the Adoration Chapel. That when I have that hour, that just centers me. It just roots me and grounds me again, and it gets me through the next couple of days, and then I kind of maybe lose my footing a little bit, but then it's back on the calendar. I'm back in the Adoration Chapel. That 1 hour a week just centers me and roots me. So she was just sharing that, and how it's like, well, you need to share that with other people, encourage other people, that we're all together, and actually as we share our faith, say, hey, this is what is working for me, this is what is rooting me, this is what is grounding me in my prayer life, in my faith life. And the beautiful thing is we all have different gifts, we all have different charisms, so some of us, it might be easy for us to be able to go and to be able to speak to others about God, to be able to actually be on mission in a very visible way, and teaching and catechizing and trying to instruct others. For some that might be a little bit harder, but the gift is that we all are unique, we all are particular, but that we're all still called. So it's just a matter of, okay, Lord, how do you want to use what you've given me to actually share how faith has transformed my life? And I can share that with the people I work with my family, with those I meet, and it's just, I'm giving credible witness of how faith actually transforms my life. And just, it's an opening, it's an invitation for people to come and see what we ourselves have seen, that the personal contact with Christ is the foundation of missionary activity. But I want, through the inspiration of John Paul II, to maybe take it a step deeper, that it's not just about our activity of what we might do as we go out, as important as that is, but some of the most important missionaries were those who actually didn't go on mission at all. So we might think of Saint Therese of Lisieux. Does anybody know that she's the patron saint of missionaries? But she entered the convent, a Carmelite cloistered convent, when she was young, and she died when she was in her 20s, and she never actually was ever on mission. But yet, she's the patron saint of missionaries. So what does that tell us? Well, she had an incredible love for missionaries and for the mission, but she knew that her prayers, her sufferings, and her sacrifices, united to Christ, would actually bear incredible fruit for those who were out on mission. So when we have a spiritual lens in our life, we might think, okay, we are supposed to use our physical gifts, our talents, to actually speak and to share faith, the good news, with others. But also everything that happens in our life, our sufferings, the sacrifices, our prayer, when they're brought and united to Christ, that's actually the fuel for missionary activity, and that actually allows the gospel to be spread. There's this saying that the next generation of Christians is born because of the blood of the martyrs. So if you look throughout the history of the church, those times where there's been an intense persecution and a lot of people have actually physically suffered, sacrificed, and have actually shed their blood for the faith, that the next generation of Christians is just on fire. It populates so much more. And in the world's mentality, you might think, how does that happen? We try to kill these people off, but here they are rapidly growing. Well, under the lens of faith, we see that makes sense, because they united their sufferings, their very life to Christ, and gave their life, and their blood became the seed, became the fertile soil for the next generation of Christians to grow. So John Paul II speaks about mission, how we're all supposed to be on mission, how we're all supposed to go and help proclaim the goodness of Christ. But he also speaks about suffering a lot. So I just want to end with a little story about how he speaks about how the sick and the suffering, when they're united to Christ, actually become missionaries themselves through their suffering, through their sickness. And this is to see things on the spiritual lens, but it's so real, of how nothing is actually lost in our life. Any of our suffering, any of the pain that we go through, it can actually be used for Christ and for the salvation of the world. So John Paul II wrote an encyclical on the nature of suffering. And I just, a story I had from one of my professors in Rome that I took a couple classes from. He was a priest. His name was Father Luke Buckles. But we all had the nickname for him. It was Teddy Bear Buckles, because he was a really, really easy examiner, which was really good. You don't need all the examiners to be easy, but you at least need a couple. So Teddy Bear Buckles, he was a great priest, an incredible teacher, but he was a really easy examiner. So it was nice to have your exam with him. But he shared this incredible story. When he was a young priest, he was a hospital chaplain. And he walked with a lot of people in intense suffering. And he shares the story once where he was a newly ordained priest in a hospital, and there was this young man who was in the hospital who had just been in a very tragic accident, and he was paralyzed now, and he'd never walk again. So this incredible suffering that this man had presently in his life and would actually have to carry with him throughout the course of his entire life. And Father Luke, he didn't quite know what to say, what to do, but he just felt inspired, primarily through reading one of the writings of John Paul II speaking about the power of suffering. So Father Luke walked into his room and introduced himself and had a little conversation with him, and this man was very down and shared the nature of the accident and that he would never walk again. And Father Luke just felt inspired. A Holy Spirit moment said, this is a terrible tragedy that's happened in your life, but today you actually have received a new vocation, a new mission for your life, and it's to be a co-redeemer with Christ. It's to unite your sufferings to Him and for the salvation of the world. Do you believe that? And this young man's face, his countenance completely changed. And he actually lit up with joy that word really spoke to him. And it changed the course of his entire life. That he never walked again. He had this suffering that he lived with. But he actually lived it with just incredible joy, because he saw that his suffering wasn't lost. That he could actually unite that to Christ for the salvation of the world, for the salvation of others. And in the words of John Paul II, that the sickness, the sufferings, those who are poor, that united to Christ, they themselves actually become missionaries. The good news, the message of Christ actually goes out, bears fruit in ways in which we can't even calculate, we can't even measure. So back to the original quote of all of us are called to be missionaries by virtue of our baptism. We have to take that seriously, but also it can be done in a lightness of just sharing how faith has transformed our life, but then also at the spiritual depths, the sufferings we might experience, the trials, the sacrifices, that those two united to Christ can actually bear fruit in ways in which we can't know, we can't measure. So this is World Mission Sunday, so there's a second collection. This has happened, it's happened in every Catholic church throughout the entire world, that there's this collection taken. It was started in 1926 by Pope Pius XI, and it's just kind of beautiful to think that all the churches throughout the world are receiving this collection to help over 1,000 different dioceses to actually go preach the gospel to places that haven't heard it yet, to actually be able to give the resources to people, to be able to build churches, to build seminaries, convents, orphanages, catechists, and schools, and everything in between. So thank you in advance for your generosity. And just to end here with that, that missionary cooperation is rooted and lived above all in personal union with Christ. So we come just to center ourselves, that it's our union with Christ that bears fruit, that allows us to be effective, allows us to be able to give witness to the credibility of the gospel. So let's let our hearts be open as we approach Him in this Holy Eucharist, in this sacrament, to receive Him, and then to be able to bring His light, His love to the world.